You know that old saying that there's nothing more true than death and taxes? Those are the only two truths in life. That's so true right now. Across the world, tax revenues are going up, specifically in G7 countries, and there's no turning back. It doesn't mean that, a new government's going to come along and lower your tax rate. Your tax rate will continue to increase, sometimes marginally, sometimes by leaps and bounds. But generally speaking, no government comes into power saying, you know what, I'm going to reduce tax revenue. I'm going to do that. And the best example is recently what Joe Biden said when it comes to taxation. He actually called for a billionaire's tax, and this is precisely what Biden said.
We have 1,000 billionaires in America. That's not a bad thing, per se. You know what their average tax rate is? 8.2% taxes. Anybody want to trade their tax rate? No, I'm serious. If we just charge them, had a tax code that charged them 25%, not the highest rate, 25%. You know how much that would raise over the next 10 years? $400 billion. $40 billion a year. Imagine what we could do. From cutting the deficit to providing for child care, to providing health care, to continue to provide our military with all they need. So folks, look, this is not beyond our capacity. We just have to listen.
So it's so interesting that Joe Biden said that about the billionaire's tax. Now, of course, 8.2%, super low. Someone might say that, they're generating revenue for the country, they're providing jobs, et cetera. Okay, but let's put that aside for a second and say, well, first of all, why jump from 8% to 25%? That's a threefold increase in taxation. But hidden within Joe Biden's message is government's here to increase tax revenue. It's not in it to reduce tax revenue. We're here to increase tax revenue. But he can't say that. He's saying, we're in it to increase tax revenue, but only on the rich, because the rich need to pay their fair share. It's the classic bait and switch. He would never get elected if he said, we're in it to increase tax revenue for the government of the United States. But instead he says the rich, kind of need to pay their fair share. A very interesting way. But also Joe Biden says, imagine what we could do with $40 billion a year. We could, do all these social programs and help out the low-income families across the United States. Well, let's talk about that for a second, because a common criticism of that type of thinking is, I'm not going to give more money to the government to somehow equate or level the playing field across this country. Now, I wanted to share with you the U.S. government's fiscal situation over the past 30 years. So let's look at this for a second. This is total receipts of the U.S. government in fiscal years 2000 to 2028. So that's right. 2028 hasn't occurred yet, but in 2022, 23, we're at 4.9 trillion dollars. Okay, total receipts. Back in 2000, it was around 2 trillion. So they've doubled. They've doubled the total receipts. Now, total receipts add up to about 4.9 trillion in US dollars in 2022. By 2028, it's expected to rise to 6.4 trillion dollars. So the United States government is not exactly broke. There's a lot of money that it is generating. Now, let's take a look at the poverty rate. And the poverty rate's really interesting across the United States, because 1990 to 2022, so this is a 30-year window, roughly, just over a 30-year window, 13.5% in 1990. It went up and down. Now, don't take these spikes as huge, because this is along a y-axis that's 6%. So 13.5% in 1990. In 2023, 11.5%. The poverty rate from over 30 years has gone down by 2%. 2% over 30 years, despite tax revenue increasing from less than $1 trillion to 4.9 trillion or whatever it is by 2022. The idea that we could potentially give government more money and they'll eradicate poverty, they'll get rid of child, poverty, they'll increase social security and social welfare. is a fallacy, is a complete fallacy. As our economies grow and get bigger, and as more and more of us work and pay bills and pay taxes, the idea that somehow the government will level that playing field for those below the poverty line is a fallacy. And there's nowhere truer than the United States. More people are paying taxes now than ever before, and they're paying more than they did before as well. And the government's collecting more than they've ever collected before. And you think that, okay, they're collecting more money. There have been a series of both Republican and Democrat presidents. Spending has gone up, revenues have gone up, but poverty remains. 11.5% has not decreased it hasn't been this dramatic decrease. And so that's not just the United States story, that's the story across the world. Canada is another clear example of its tax revenue constantly going up. Canada, let me just grab this for you. Oh, here's another thing before I leave the United States. Military expenditure has gone up, and this is from 1977. Now, this is the world, but in general. But if you look at the world's military expenditure, it's also going up. So, this idea that somehow we're taking tax revenue and we're spending it to help those in levels of poverty that should be unbecoming in developed nations. I'm not saying it's not happening. There are a lot of programs and services, perhaps more so than before, but it's not like we've we got $100 billion more in revenue. Let's spend a few billion and fix, running water, drinking water here in Canada for First Nations on reserve. That's not happening, So let's be very clear. The business of government is to collect more taxation, spend more in very specific areas, whether that's quote unquote fighting climate change. And I don't want to make light of that because I think some people take it that I am making light of it. Fighting climate change is a great kind of title to say we're doing something on a global level, but it's not actually working, right? It's a great way to spend money without necessarily saying there's any results. So governments can commit, hey, we're spending more than. How many times have you heard government leaders say we're spending more on this issue than any other president in the past, whether that's housing, infrastructure, roads, and then there's global issues. We're spending more to make sure that Ukraine is safe. We're spending more on global security. That's a common phrase that many world leaders discuss. And I think climate change is a great banner for another global initiative for governments to say, hey, we're spending more than ever before and we're making the world a peaceful, better place, etc. Of course they're going to say that. But what they're really saying is we're taxing more than ever before. By the way, our government is collecting more revenue than ever before. We're not really interested in helping the child poverty rate become obsolete. We're not interested in the United States case of making sure that literacy rates get up above 80 to 85%. No. We're not interested in that. We're interested in fighting climate change. We're interested in protecting Ukraine from Russia. We're going to dump money in other areas because there's virtue signaling, etc. But also, it's a great way to hide the notion, the reality that spending has never been higher than ever before. And this does not matter if you're Republican, Democrat, liberal, conservative. Spending has never been higher. And so we as the citizens of these countries have to constantly ask and demand of our governments more and more accountability and transparency, and to have a real conversation about what's happening with our tax dollars. So again, it's not just the United States. There are many countries. Here's another example. Canada, let me just grab this for you so that you can see what I'm seeing. Canada's tax revenue reported at 25 billion US in Jan 2024, which is an increase from 23 billion a year earlier. It's updated monthly, averaging 14 billion from Jan 96 to Jan 2024. So we have doubled our tax revenue. Just about doubled our tax revenue from 1996 to 2024. Think about that for a second. Almost 30 years later, and we've doubled our tax revenue. The data reached an all-time high of 28 billion in Feb 2023 and a record low of 5 billion in April 96. So this is a clear example. This is just over a year, just to show. But we've doubled our tax revenue from 14 billion in 1996 to 25 billion, almost doubled by 2024. Again, liberal and conservative governments during that time. Our population hasn't doubled from 1996 to 2024. I don't believe there's double the amount of people making $100,000 and above, et cetera, paying all these taxes. So what's happening? Well, the tax rates continue to marginally increase year over year. They're collecting more money than ever before, and they're spending it. Another example. Okay, I don't want to make this all about doom and gloom, right? But like the government of Canada here, we have public health care, and public health care is a big thing, and it's something that we really stand behind, and we want to make sure that it stays public. We want to make sure that our public health care stays public. But there are things within our public healthcare system that aren't public. You can't get eye care. Most people can't get eye care. Most people can't get dental care. Most people can't get massage and physio and chiropractor. All of those things you have to pay out of pocket if you're a Canadian. And yet, and there have been calls for this to be, part of the public healthcare system. I personally think that first initial eye exam should be covered by the government, personally. I mean, especially after 40. I'm not 40, but I can imagine when I turn 40, eye care becomes a concern. Uh, Physiotherapy, chiropractor, all these things become a concern. So I would say that the initial appointment for eye care should be covered by the government. We pay so many taxes that could easily be covered for the majority of the population. It's not. But you know what is covered? Gender affirming care. Now, I don't mean for this to be like a way in which we divide our population, but gender affirming care was brought into many provincial health insurance plans, excuse me, just recently. In 2016, here in Ontario, it was brought in. In many other provinces, it was around the same time. Now, gender affirming care is defined by the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, WPATH. In WPATH, it outlines what gender affirming care is. And gender affirming care can be anything from hormone therapy to upper and lower surgery. And it goes into a lot of detail about what those surgeries are, as well as, counseling, et cetera, et cetera. Well, back in just earlier this year, there's a citizen in Ontario who goes by the name KS, non-binary individual, wanted to do lower surgery. I'm not going to get into the details of the surgery. For some, it's very graphic, but wanted to do the surgery here in Ontario. The Ontario Health Insurance Plan says this isn't covered. This is an experimental surgery. We're not going to cover it. It goes against the Health Act, etc. This person flies down to Texas, gets their surgery, and bills Ontario for it. Well, Ontario says, listen, we're not paying this bill. This is an experimental surgery. You did this. This is not our deal. The person takes them to court. And what happens is the courts say, let me get this up for you. The courts rule that the Ontario Health Plan must pay for gender-affirming surgery in Texas. Ontario's publicly funded health insurance must pay for a special procedure in Texas for a non-binary person seeking gender-affirming care. It was a 3-0 ruling by the divisional court that on gender-affirming care on treatment for non-binary people. So it goes into detail about what happened, and then what it said was key to the divisional court's ruling was its finding that Ontario had incorporated an international standard of medical care, we talked about WPATH, and recommends individualized treatment plans for non-binary people that affirm their experience of gender. The ruling was not about the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It was a matter of interpreting the health insurance law. That law mentions vaginoplasty, which was the surgery that was undertaken. OHIP argues that the specific treatment of vaginoplasty is not mentioned in the listed benefits, and is therefore experimental and therefore not covered. The court said that while the law's meaning was clear, the judges would have relied on the Charter of Values to settle the dispute. The Charter of Rights protects the right to equality and security of the person, which includes autonomy and bodily integrity. Interpreting the health insurance law to require transgender or non-binary people to remove their, okay, I'm not going to get into, it gets into quite graphic, but you can see this is something that is covered by the provincial public health insurance plan. And why we're not covering eye care and dental care, and why so many Canadians have argued and petitioned for that, and that's not part of our healthcare plans. It just remains a mystery why gender affirming care was so rapidly picked up and funded fully by the government. It lends itself to a political narrative. It lends itself to support for the LGBTQ community without robust debate. And this gets back to the taxation piece. The idea that the government will reduce revenue is not a thing. It'll continue to increase revenue. What it spends its money on will be very politicized in the future. It won't be about lifting people out of poverty, eradicating child poverty, welfare, getting people off welfare, paying people, quote unquote, a livable wage. It won't. It might do some of those things marginally, but by and large, the bulk of the spending will be on politically driven ideas. Here's another example, and perhaps the last example, because I know some people might have ideas, and I'd love to hear what you have to think. But aid to Ukraine by country. The United States, $75 billion. Now, $75 billion, that's a lot of money, right? That's a lot of money to say to a state, provide aid. These are bilateral commitments, so the United States has committed to it. Germany as well has committed $24 billion, and the list goes down. Canada, $6.3 billion. Most European countries, Spain, $1 billion, but they have EU commitments. So to be a member of the EU, you also have to commit to aiding Ukraine. Canada, $6.3 billion, right? These are not small amounts of money. These are large sums of money, right? So we're spending more than ever before, but it's on politically motivated issues. And, the question will always remain to me is the loop back, right? Like any business, we spent money on, new equipment, did it get the job done? I don't know. I mean, who's going to invest in that company if that CEO says that? Hey, we raised our prices on our goods. We increased revenues. Did you pay your workers more? I don't know. Did you, broaden your investments? Yeah, we definitely did. We built more factories. Okay. So what was the end result of all that? I don't know. So you spent all this money on new factories, but did your productivity go up? Did this go up? Did that go up? I don't know. And that, I think, is part of the frustration that so many Canadians, so many people around the world are having. They're seeing so much more taxation, unaffordability. We have police, firefighters, etc., that can't afford the cities they live in. And tax revenue keeps going up. And this lends itself to the resentment, the distrust in government, the mistrust that the media is not covering this. And I think this is truly the reason why one of the reasons why so many people are saying, I can't afford groceries, but our government doesn't care too much about my struggle. They care about climate change and Ukraine and this and that and other military spending and more money here. And the poverty rate has gone down marginally despite revenues going up through the roof. It's like, so the conclusion is revenues will continue to rise. spending will continue to rise on more politicized topics, it's our job in civil society to let governments know we know the game and we want to call them out on it a little bit. But what do you think? Let me know in the comment section below.